be to put the question to our invited guests on the subject of the future transport. Everyone is encouraged to take part in the discussion on social media using the hashtag future transport. So, we'd like to welcome our visitors in the public gallery this morning, and you are very welcome to watch and listen to our proceedings. Could I also ask everyone to check that their electronic devices are switched to silent mode so as to avoid any interruptions? First of all, declaration of interest. The committee is recommended to note the list of offices held by Assembly members. Yes, if you could switch off your mobile device, I'm very grateful. Members are asked to declare any disclosed pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda and declare any other relevant interests. No? Good. Minutes. Trust everyone's had a chance to read the minutes. The committee is recommended to confirm the minutes of the meeting of the Transport Committee held on the 12th of July 2017 and 18th July 2017 to be signed by the Chairman to the correct record. Do we agree with that? Thank you. List of actions. The committee is recommended to note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings of the committee. So, now we get to the interesting bit. So I'd like to welcome for the first session, we have two sessions a day. First session I'd like to welcome Rob Wallace, Transport Research Laboratory, Dan Phillips from Gateway Project.
Actually, Royal College of Art.
Royal College of Arts,
yes, but,
right, thank you very much.
I'm representing the Gateway Project, I guess.
Arts. Well, that sounds much nicer anyway. Royal College of Arts. Professor Tanasha Merat, University of Leeds, and David Wong, Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. So thank you very much for coming along. I shall kick off proceedings with the first question. So this is to all of you, so perhaps if you would like to start, Rob, and then work our way along, if that's okay. How likely are we to see a large number of autonomous vehicles on London roads in the next 10 to 20 years? And what are the biggest hurdles yet to be overcome? We'll start with those two.
Okay, thank you, Keith. I think the real challenge here is that nobody really does know the answer to this. It's purely a speculative opinion of various organisations and individuals. I think one of the interesting things for TRL is to look at what the automotive industry is doing and how quickly they are developing products and how much they are pushing hard to claim to bring those products to market. Ford being an example, talking about 2020 to 2021, somewhere in that time frame, having a commercially available platform and vehicle for automated driving capable of servicing the needs of a car sharing or mobility as a service type proposition. So I think we're really talking about probably 3 years from now being the fastest by which we might get some kind of commercial platform available. The real uptake and usage, the real volume adoption of automation, though, we think is going to probably take another 10 years or so, probably around about the 2030. In fact, there's some recent US research that's just been published by an organisation called Rethink X, and they're talking about the US market, which of course is very different to the UK, but what they're talking about is that 95% of US passenger miles travelled will be served by on-demand automated vehicles, electric automated vehicles. And I think generally from a TRL perspective, what we believe is this is an absolute revolution, probably akin to the shift from horse and cart through to the introduction of a motor vehicle in the 1910, 1920 kind of period, particularly with Henry Ford's Model T. The absolute kind of revolution we saw over a 10-year period in the early part of the last century is probably the kind of uptake and usage that we're going to see in this period from 2020 through to 2030.
Interesting. Thank you. Dan?
Hi there, everyone. So I think that the uptake is going to be dependent on a number of factors. So technological development, replacement of existing vehicles, and then political and community support, which you might call the market. In terms of the timescales, I think we'll get, we're already seeing very good autonomous vehicles on the market today. So the technology is getting there. So 2020 onwards, I think you'll get level 3 vehicles, which is effectively vehicles that have basic autonomous features like advanced cruise control, lane changing, crash avoidance, self-parking in most vehicles between 20 and 2025. Between 2025 and 2030, perhaps will be most vehicles will have advanced autonomous control. Some will have no steering wheel at all, and the others will have a steering wheel, but you won't have to use it necessarily. And then from 2030 onwards, I think more and more vehicles will become available without steering, and it's more likely that those will be public vehicles or shared vehicles rather than private vehicles, although I think there will be an uptake in private vehicles without steering because of the change in the experience that they provide. I mean, it's moving from basically using a car to get around to being in a moving room where you can do other things, where you can relax or work or chat or sleep, potentially, which is one of the challenges. You know, that's a big risk. So that's my thoughts on it. And in terms of a comparison, I'd say a better comparison would be the change from coal-fired heating in homes to centrally controlled gas-fired boilers. So coal-fired heating required people, creates a lot of pollution, has lots of problems associated with it. When you put in gas-fired heating into homes, they were all controlled automatically. Comfort levels went up, risk went down, and you know, but there are problems associated with it as well, because obviously people might abuse the system. So I think, you know, it's interesting to think of parallel transformations rather than just strictly automotive comparisons.
Just probably worth giving you a little bit of my background. So I work on the human factors side of automated vehicles. And most of my research so far has been looking at what drivers do in our driving simulator when the vehicle is automated and how they deal with failures or limitations, etc. And also in the last couple of years, been looking specifically on the interaction of people outside of the fully automated vehicle where there's no driver, so that like the gateway low speed. So a lot of my work is now in this kind of situation where we talk about terminology and when will they come. And I think I just want to make that distinction about what we mean by automated vehicles. So as mentioned, there are a lot of systems already in our privately owned vehicles, which some might say are what we call automation, and that's increasing more and more. And the manufacturers are all bringing up some kind of time. So Volvo mentioned 2017, in about 2014, that they will be on the road. And there are some cars in Gothenburg, but they are, there is a driver in there all the time. Ford has mentioned robo-taxis in 2020. So there are sort of lots of dates being announced, and the technology, one would say, is theoretically there, but there are some barriers that will be a problem when it comes to actually people using them. So the first thing is that a fully automated vehicle that can go from A to B without any intervention is probably around $150,000 to $200,000. So by 2020, that has to reduce quite massively if that's going to be implemented for privately owned vehicles. On the other hand, we have the sort of low speed, fully automated, where it can go from A to B using maps and radar, LiDAR, etc. They're actually running around already in sort of demonstrations, so one could argue that they're already there available. The Docklands Light Railway is an example, or the Heathrow pods that they could be considered automated vehicles. So I think for me, one of my challenges is trying to make sure, what do we mean by an automated vehicle? Is everyone thinking of the Google car or Uber, or are you thinking about our own private cars? So I would say much later, for a fully automated vehicle that can take me from A to B and I don't have to intervene, I'm thinking more like 2030, 2040, because the issues are around acceptability, trust, uptake, affordability, etc., infrastructure availability, connectivity, and so on. So I think I'm a little bit more, my students call me a party pooper when it comes to it.
I think Natasha made a very important point that I wish to pick up on. It's basically about defining the levels of automation, because a lot of noise is out there in the public, confusing and conflating vehicle automation and autonomous vehicles. So when we talk about uptake of autonomous vehicles, I think we need to be very careful what we mean by autonomous vehicles, because for the industry, for the automotive industry, we conceive of automation in terms of the Society of Automotive Engineers, the SAE levels, defined levels of automation. That's from level 1 all the way through to level 5. And levels 1 and 2 are basically what we already have in many vehicles at the moment in the market, so already deployed. And uptake is very encouraging. I'll give you an example. Level 1 and level 2, these are, for example, autonomous emergency braking. So vehicles that can brake themselves at low speed, particularly in urban environments. So based on 2015 registration data, and we registered about 2.6 million vehicles in 2015 here in the UK, about 2 in 5, that's nearly 40% of all those vehicles registered in 2015, have autonomous emergency braking either as a standard or optional fitment in it. And of those 2.6 million vehicles registered, about nearly a third of them have adaptive cruise control. So these are automated technologies, but they're level 1, level 2, and they're already available in the market. Then what about level 3? Then level 3, we wouldn't consider this autonomous, given the definition of the SAE, but these are vehicles with the sort of technology where people can actually go hands-off for a limited period of time. And level 3 is basically where the computer, we call it basically the system, performs the dynamic driving task, and the driver does not need to monitor the environment. But, crucially, he or she must be prepared to take back control should the use case come to an end, or should the computer or the system tells the driver to take back control. Example, it's not deployed yet, but example is that Audi, a couple of months ago, launched its flagship A8 model in Barcelona with the world's first level 3 technology, which they call Traffic Jam Pilot, the TJP. It will be available in the market next year. Then we talk about level 4 and level 5, which by industry parlance would be considered autonomous, because technically speaking, the driver is out of the loop, and that means there is no expectation for the driver to take back control of the vehicle within the defined use case. Example, level 4. The Volvo trials in Gothenburg, which they were intending to do the same in London, as they announced last year, but we're still waiting for them to trial these in London. So essentially that's a level 4 technology. It may in the first instance be done on a use case basis, junction to junction, in a motorway. And that's the use case. And within that use case, there is no expectation for the driver to actually take back control. But once the use case is done, it's over, and you hit the final junction, the car will prompt you to take back control. So that's level 4 technology. There will still be a steering wheel. Now, when will it be deployed? That is a question that you were asking in terms of uptake of autonomous vehicles. So Volvo has announced 2021. Ford has announced its robo-taxis, as alluded to by my colleagues, around about 2020, 2021. BMW has announced level 3, level 4, around about 2021 as well. So there will be some deployment at the level 4, stage technology by 2021. Then we come to level 5. We're going by industry definition. There will not be a steering wheel, where essentially there will be no drivers and you'll just be a passenger. And it's capable of maneuvering, navigating end-to-end journeys. And that's probably like some of the pods that you will see running around in the geofence area within a city, for example, without a driver, without a steering wheel. We are thinking that probably between 2025 to 2030 we may see the first level 5 vehicles, but only in very, very small numbers. Real uptake would probably be 2035 and beyond. But that said, it all depends on quite a number of circumstances. Regulation, for example, consumer confidence, and also other circumstances, which may actually encourage the early adoption of these vehicles. So it's not as simple as saying autonomous vehicles uptake would be year X or year Y. It's really about defined levels of automation when they will come on stream.
That's very helpful. And what different types of AV do you think will enter the commercial market? David, you want to kick off?
Types of AV.
Commercial vehicles, because we've got, mainly what you've been talking about is either what would replace a cab or what would replace your own car, but what about commercial vehicles? Have you any thoughts on that?
One of the interesting ones would be, first and foremost, a trial of connected technology with some automation in the form of truck platooning, which my colleague Rob's organization, TRL, will be conducting very soon. That's commercial vehicle, but that's at the trial stage. It's not yet going to be deployed commercially in the market. But what's quite interesting is that, and something to watch out for, is demand-responsive taxis or demand-responsive buses, minibuses, essentially, which, to my understanding, will be trialed soon in London. And there is a government-funded project that is very close to testing these next year and the year after in London. So that would probably be an interesting development in terms of eventually deploying commercial vehicles in the form of demand-responsive transport for the public.
Okay. Rob, do you want to come in at this point and tell us about your trial?
Yes, I think you may have seen some of the announcements over the last few weeks. The Highways England and the Department for Transport have actually given the go-ahead for platooning trials, which TRL is leading, but it has a consortium of other organisations working with us. And this is essentially using 2 or 3 trucks in an electronically connected form, where by reducing the distance between the trucks and getting them to kind of close up in a train or a platoon, you get all sorts of benefits in terms of the 2 drivers behind, and the amount of time that they can relax while that platooning is going on, but also the aerodynamics generate quite a reduction in fuel usage and emissions as well. Having said that, the technology isn't new. Some of this platooning has been carried out in the US, and it has also been carried out successfully across various parts of continental Europe. I think what's different, and what we're trying to do in the UK, is actually do this in a real-world testing environment. So most of the other research that's been going on in other continents has been in controlled environments, not in real-life traffic environments. But now the technology is relatively mature, so actually there's a level of confidence to actually immerse this in amongst normal traffic and other drivers. The other aspect that's different about the UK trials is the layout of the motorways in the UK is different. Highways in the US, and actually a lot of the main highways across Europe, as an example, the exit and entry roads onto the motorways are very different, and there are different distances and so on. So actually, even if it works in Germany or it works in France, that doesn't necessarily mean it works or is attractive commercially in the UK. So we're trying to look also at the commercial viability as well as, crucially, the safety aspect of whether platooning is good for Britain's roads.
Thank
With your indulgence, if I may add very quickly, is that what we are quite likely to see in the context of London, because I believe this inquiry is about London, would be the last mile transport. So I mentioned demand responsive transport, but particularly relevant for last mile journeys in the context of London, for example, in a tightly geofence defined area in certain parts of London. A lot of promise for that sort of technology, and we may see deployment of that sort of technology quite soon, depending on how the trials go. For example, I mean, the Gateway trial with those ports has very promising development there, and there are many other ports that have been trialed in other parts of the country. They could be applied to London.
I'd like to sort of bring it to life a bit. I've shared a few pictures with you.
Yeah.
So if you go to page 8, or page 7, just to start with, you know, we see AVs coming into life to support both people movement and goods movement, and we think that there will be a combination of shared and public vehicles with some private vehicles. And they will go from everything from assisting disabled people to providing this last mile inclusive community transportation. And they could support people from a one person moving around to 20 people moving around or more. We've shown that you can use autonomy to help people who are disabled. You know, just get around the streets. You know, if they're blind or they have a wheelchair but they have a child they'd like to take with them, and a small autonomous buggy can effectively provide guidance for people. We also think that these autonomous systems and, you know, the advent of assisted electric motors is going to provide a bridge between cycling and, you know, and larger forms of electric vehicle. So I think there's a big opportunity for the city to look at electric bikes, but also more advanced electric assisted vehicles that could support older people or disabled people to get around more easily. The range of vehicles that you provide in a city really transforms the congestion in a city. So many people move around in a vehicle designed for their general needs rather than their specific needs. So we see if cities and manufacturers start to design smart autonomous vehicles that might support one or two people, that would reduce the road space required and increase the number of vehicles that could actually travel platoon together and move closely around. So that's an interesting area to look at. Larger vehicles, I mean, we've spoken to 100 people in workshops. We had about 30,000 visitors to an exhibition at the London Transport Museum. And we spent a lot of time with them to try and understand their hopes and fears. And over 80% of people saw autonomous vehicles as vehicles that would be shared. But there was a big group of people that thought that they would have a privately owned vehicle, and that was families who have such a diverse set of requirements that even in a well-connected city like London, you know, we already see that a lot of families, you know, want to have a private car. So whilst we could see people moving away from using their private cars, some groups will still buy them. So that's an interesting area, the family car, what's that going to look like? And then on page 13, we've been talking, we look at these smaller community buses. We call it a flexi bus. So how a bus might deal with these last mile journeys, particularly for older people, people carrying shopping in bad weather. You know, these smaller vehicles could have some of this intelligent routing built into them so that they can move around a local community and fill in these transport deserts that you've mentioned in your report. And then moving on, we might see school buses or larger vehicles that provide transport, so that's page 14. And then outside of moving people around, we can see services supporting community needs. So, for example, autonomous vehicles that support health and well-being in the community, or even autonomous vehicles that collect and recycle material. So we used to call it waste and rubbish, but perhaps, you know, these vehicles would be part of a circular economy where material is collected and reused and sorted. So I see, you know, we're trying to bring this to life rather than talk about it in an abstract way. And hopefully these diagrams and early sketches help to give you some flavour of the range that might appear in the future. And this is work in progress, so it's not finished work.
Did you want to say anything?
Did you want me to talk about the particular types of vehicles?
What we think are what different types of AV
Can I
will
ask
enter
you
the
to
commercial
speak up, by
market.
the way, because I've got a hearing impairment and this room
Yeah,
is
it's a
lovely,
bit,
but
the
it's not
acoustics are a
great
bit
for
suspect,
hearing.
actually, yeah. So, yeah, different kinds of AV in the commercial market.
I
Commercial
think, yeah,
vehicles.
for me, I guess if I put a bit of a spin on it, is that for me, in this context, it's very much about do we see these vehicles coming and everyone being able to buy for their needs and different sort of commercial vehicles coming in and kind of anyone can do what they want kind of thing, or do we look at it from a public point of view? Because while it's nice to see that there is a large range of possibilities at the end of the day, especially when there's a mixture of still manual for a long time, 10, 15 years, and then sort of semi-automated to fully automated, then what does that mean in terms of our mobility within a city like London, which is already quite congested? So I think if I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking more about, well, what proportion of these vehicles should be public or public-private, and what proportion of these vehicles should be owned by us? And you were saying about the family car. Well, I cannot see that the family car already cannot come into the city. So I think we have to have different proportions of vehicle for different roads. So within the city, I would say that it has to be publicly owned or public-private partnerships, and for getting to the city, then there are other versions where you might have privately owned vehicles, which may or may not be automated. And don't forget the other modes. That's the other thing, but we'll come to that.
Okay, thank you.
Well, you're talking about the breakdown between public and private. Surely that's going to be determined by the market. Because the only reason, for example, you said family vehicles don't come into the centre of town is because it's congested and it's expensive.
It's going to be. I think it's going to be partly determined by the market and the user. Yeah. So London, you know better than I do probably that Londoners don't own cars as much as the rest of the country, and the ownership and licensing for Londoners in particular is a lot lower than the rest of the country. Probably for good reasons. You have a very good public transport system in comparison. It's too expensive to park, it's too expensive to run it, etc., etc. So I think there is going to be an
But these are all decisions made by individuals because of the environment around them. But it seems to me that you were kind of suggesting that there might be some centrally directed diktat that a certain proportion would be public and a certain proportion would be private.
So some sections would be...
A certain proportion of traffic on the road will be public and a proportion will be private, rather than leaving it to the market to decide.
Yeah, I think we will have to go with, as you say, the consumer's needs and desires, and things like sharing will definitely be part of it. So I think what I'm hoping is that cities will have some. I mean, it's very much the European model rather than the US model, where the US model is do what you want to do, and you know it's a free country kind of thing. Whereas we have that bit more of a balance. I hope that we will have a bit more of a control as to what proportion of the cars that are being used are going to be privately owned versus public.
Some would hope. Some would hope. Not everyone.
Assembly Member Russell.
Yes, I'm just wondering if any of you have a vision for reducing the overall number of vehicles on our streets. You know, when we start talking about platooning and you know, all these different kinds of autonomous vehicles that might be on our streets, we currently have in London a massive problem of congestion. We have desperate problems of physical inactivity, which are causing big health issues across our city. Anyone, you know, any borough is worried about their Year 6 pupils, who are all more obese than Year 6 pupils used to be in previous generations. So do you see there are some opportunities, unlike Andrew's market-driven vision, to actually use autonomous vehicles for good, to actually deliver benefits to Londoners in terms of our health and actually making our streets into less congested, less polluted and more pleasant places?
I mean, the research that we've done shows that there's a great appetite for autonomous vehicles, that a lot of people in London do not like driving. They don't find it an enjoyable experience or a valuable use of their time. So I think that there is a demand already to have a better quality of mobility in the city. I don't think we should think of autonomy as separate from all the other issues that a city faces around health and well-being, around access, around inclusivity. So it's important that, you know, autonomy isn't just the solution. You know, I've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But I would say that autonomy, because of its nature, its characteristics, increases the likelihood of sharing, increases the likelihood of reduced private ownership, particularly in a dense urban environment that has a high quality public infrastructure. And so it's something that is really worth developing and understanding and testing and trialling and bringing to life for people, and to bring people along with it so that it's not seen as something that's imposed upon them, but something that they're...
We're going to pick up issues around reducing traffic congestion and so on a bit later. So,
but specifically in terms, just the fact that autonomous vehicles will come to you,
yes.
That they don't have to park outside your home, means that you're more likely to use a shared vehicle rather than...
Yeah, that makes sense. Right, if we can move on then to question 2. So remember pigeons.
I want to pick up the issue of ethics and safety around all of this, and I think I'm looking at level 5 vehicles, if I understand, so that's sort of fully automated, which is kind of what most of us, I think, have in our minds. Perhaps I could start with Professor Marat. What are the main ethical and safety concerns surrounding widespread adoption of AVs at level 5?
Well, I would say that actually level 5 is probably the safest and most ethical, because by then it's developed in a way that the system is theoretically foolproof. I think the manufacturers, certainly Volvo, when it's coming to level 4 even, is suggesting that it is responsible for the vehicle being able to get from A to B within the designated areas. I think the times when, in terms of safety, the issues are probably more around the fact that we, as the controllers on levels 2 and 3 and possibly 4, are not necessarily sure what it can and can't do at the moment, and for a while. Terminology can be quite confusing, so the word autopilot makes you think that it can drive itself. Even if you don't think it can drive itself and you are supposed to monitor it some of the time, it's difficult to know what that some of the time means for the average driver. Even if you know that you have to look at it every minute or every 30 seconds or whatever, the likelihood of you being able to do that for a long time is very hard. We as human beings are not very good at being operators, and we're very easily distracted even with the manual control vehicles. So these are the times that sort of from a driver's point of view, these are the occasions where safety is an issue, in my opinion. Ethics, I try not to get involved in that because there's always sort of these questions about who should it crash into, etc. And there's a lot of debate from the lawyers and ethics people on that side, and I don't know what the answer is for that. But I do know that actually on the level 5, for example, these are very safe vehicles. They will not crash into you. They will stop and are much better than a manually controlled vehicle. However, then it leads to the sort of issue of, well, on the one hand, how will that affect flow in the roads? But actually, a colleague of mine who was saying, actually, this will be really nice because it means that we can regain as pedestrians and cyclists, we can regain the streets, because I've noticed more and more now, I've started walking and I've noticed how when we're in our metal boxes, we feel like we own the road, and perhaps the automated vehicles will be nicer than driven vehicles. So in terms of safety, I would say there's lots of work still to be done, and the most important thing is making sure that the driver and the controller of the vehicle is aware of its capabilities, where it can and can't work, what it does and it doesn't do. And for example, if a system is in place that it lets the vehicle be safer, then the driver needs to let it do its job, which again is a difficult one. So ACC is a good example where it's available because it's a good thing, it helps with our safeties, but a lot of drivers don't like it, they don't use it. So sort of just some of the challenges I think we can have.
Perhaps I could bring in maybe, Dan, if I could bring you in about these ethical and safety concerns. I know you've set out some in this paperwork you've given us, but also what regulation you think will be needed to ensure autonomous vehicles are used safely. Would the operator driver need some sort of licence? What about insurance?
Well, that I think there was a question further along the line in your general questions. But in terms of ethics and safety, I think the experts technically, I'm not a technical expert in the control systems, but what we're interested in is what people say they're concerned about and how designers can engage in those concerns and how citizens can engage in those concerns. So we've got things like, the fact that if we move to these driverless vehicles and they're all electric, then for a lot of people, whether they're old or disabled, they feel quite insecure in those environments because it's a change. Just like the change from Exhibition Road, moving from pavements to a single surface, has been a concern for people with disabilities. So I think AVs have to take those environments into account. And I think one of the biggest ethical challenges is the sort of relationship between the computer program, which might well be programmed to maximise profit, and to maximise profit you want to increase the number of people that you pick up, maybe the speed at which you travel, the areas that you go to, and the areas that you avoid. So there are interesting, underlying ethical issues that I think are worth examining. And then there's, the whole safety thing. I mean, as a cyclist, I make eye contact with other drivers constantly. And I think this lack of eye contact with a driverless vehicle might well be a problem. Is there a design solution that can help to overcome that problem? And then this general ethical issue around accidents. And, personally, I think that I'm with what I sort of feel like it's overblown because I think there's already evidence that autonomous vehicles crash less than driven vehicles. Because unfortunately us human beings, we get tired, we're in a rush, we get angry. Some of us drink while we drive, some of us on our mobile phones while we drive. So there are all sorts of edge conditions for human beings that just don't happen if you've got an autonomous vehicle.
But there still could be a collision, and therefore where would the blame...
And so, I mean, the same, as far as I
worked
understand, our partner in the Gateway project is the Royal Sun Alliance, RSA, and they're developing the insurance model for autonomous vehicles. And, you know, it's going to be probably similar to the airline industry, that effectively you have a no-blame insurance, because you have to see it as it's a systemic challenge rather than, you know, the individual driver's fault. Because there isn't a driver, there's a system. But, you know, in order to overcome that, I think we have to prove that these vehicles are capable of driving well. So, you know, what's the digital driving test for an autonomous vehicle? What's the physical driving test for an autonomous vehicle? I mean, personally, I'd love it if a driving test instructor could get into an autonomous vehicle and carry out the driving test with the vehicle.
Yeah. Rob, do you want to come in on my main question, and also this issue about what regulation might be needed and so on?
Yes, and I think it's very interesting. I'm not sure if the committee is aware, but it's 20 years today since the introduction in the UK and across Europe of the NCAP, a crashworthiness programme. So TRL, together with the DFT, actually led the whole creation of that safety standard for the construction of vehicles. And it's really interesting that over time, that's just become kind of adopted as custom and practice, and nobody talks about crashworthiness because the automotive industry has responded extremely positively and made our vehicles very safe. But that's almost kind of when drivers make mistakes and cars crash, let's make sure the crash is quite safe. Going forwards with autonomy, cars won't crash quite as often, we hope. On the one hand, the introduction of various levels of autonomy can create uncertainty and perceived risk in people. You know, they don't really know how safe these things are. But there's an awful lot of emerging evidence now that says exactly the opposite. You know, 95% of the deaths and serious injuries on the road anywhere in the world predominantly have some element of human interaction that has made a contribution to that accident. If you are able to take the driver out of the equation, some of the time or all of the time, there should be a demonstrable reduction in deaths and serious injuries. So the societal benefit of that alone says this is worth pushing really hard to see if we can make it work. From a regulatory point of view, though, I think there are real barriers to overcome. We talked earlier on about the technology emerging at quite a fast pace and slightly different opinions perhaps on the timing of real uptake and usage. But the uptake and usage is not probably held back by the development innovation around technology, but it's more these barriers around how do we bring these new innovative technologies into society. And these are things like the driver rules and the driver licensing. If drivers aren't going to drive vehicles going forwards, do they need a driving license? Or if they're going to drive a semi-automated vehicle, is that a different type of driving test where they have to learn and understand all of these available technologies that they have in the vehicles that they might buy? Criminal law and the procedures around criminal law when we have situations where drivers are driving vehicles improperly or drinking and driving and so on. To what extent is someone in a vehicle that is being driven autonomously who is over the legal limit for alcohol breaking the law? If they perhaps drove for some of the journey and autonomously for other parts of the journey, can you prove that they were actually ever in control of the vehicle at a point in time and therefore breaking the law? Civil liberties around personal injury. You know, the extent to which personal injury insurance and liabilities needs to be considered. We talked already about the insurance industry. The insurance industry really does see a massive disruption from this. Broadly speaking, we have a UK insurance industry that is predicated on insuring drivers. And we all have our various risk profiles and the amount of no claims bonus and so on. Going forwards, the driver may not be the insured entity, it may be more the vehicle. And then if it's insuring the vehicle, is it the vehicle manufacturer, is it the vehicle owner, is it the vehicle operator, or is it, as Dan described, some kind of systematic approach to the whole system of how that vehicle is used? Data privacy from a regulation point of view comes in here as well. These vehicles will have, by their very nature, an enormous amount more data enormous amount more insight about how the vehicle's been used, who's in the vehicle, where the vehicle's been going, and so on. So there's a data privacy challenge, but also a cyber security challenge from a hacking perspective. But I think one of the most challenging scenarios around ethics and safety, all of those are just changes to the law. You know, the right people need to get around a table and kind of work through those over time and remove those barriers, so that the industry can continue to innovate and bring the safety benefits to the marketplace. From a TRL perspective, I think the biggest challenge we see is in the ethical decisions that need to be made around when should a vehicle hit the tree and hurt the occupants rather than hit the pedestrian and save the life of the occupants, or other such scenarios.
Yes, and who programs
as human
that?
beings, we always have a reasonably strong self-preservation instinct, and trying to emulate how humans would behave in an automated scenario might not be the right answer. And I don't think TRL particularly has an opinion on what the right answer is, but we know it's a question that needs to really be addressed relatively quickly over the next 5 years to 10 years.
It's really helpful, thank you. David, did you have anything to add on this? before we move on?
Five specific areas of regulation that will determine whether the UK become one of the leading markets for autonomous vehicles, a flourishing market, a market where everything works well, if we get the regulations and policy and standards correct. So 5 particular areas. First one is actually our Road Traffic Act 1988. Strictly speaking, autonomous vehicles, i.e. level 4 and level 5, actually cannot be deployed, even if the technology were available today, because the Road Traffic Act doesn't allow it. So the RTA, which is based on or underpinned by the Highway Code and the Construction and Use Regulations, for example, Highway Code Rule 150, 160, and Construction and Use Regulation Rule 104, say that basically the driver has to be in control of the vehicle, have a good view of the road ahead, pay attention to driving, hands on wheels. That's incompatible with level 4. So in the first place, we have to actually look at what sort of regulation out there that we need to tweak. So RTA, i.e. the Highway Code and Construction and Use Regulation, will be the first one that ought to be tackled to enable the deployment of level 4 and level 5. Secondly, running in parallel with our Road Traffic Act is actually what's happening internationally. Because a lot of these regulations related to safety of autonomous vehicles are not done in Brussels, but done in Geneva. And it's the UNECE. Specifically Regulation 79, for example, the automatically commanded steering function. As things stand, even you have such technology available, your vehicle cannot maneuver laterally, i.e. overtake, beyond 10 kilometers an hour. Now, of course, if you have an autonomous vehicle, you want it to do just that, right? To safely overtake. And for that to be possible, it needs to be more than 10 kilometers an hour. As things stand, we can't do that because of Regulation 79, and that is in the process of being tweaked. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is actually insurance, which my colleagues alluded to. And this is very critical, because in the Automated and Electric Vehicles Bill, which will be shortly introduced in Parliament, probably has a new lease of life after the Vehicle Technology and Aviation Bill was put to bed because of the elections. But the AEV bill, from our understanding, will have the same insurance framework proposal as the Vehicle Technology and Aviation Bill, i.e. the desire of the government to create a single insurer model for level 4 and eventually level 5 vehicles that are owned. Now, these are not public pods that you can hire, but these are owned vehicles. So assuming one owns these vehicles, because obviously in the UK, we insure the driver, we don't insure the vehicle. So the desire of the government is to, or rather the policy intent is to create a single insurer model whereby the driver and the occupants and third parties are all covered. In the event there is an accident involving an AV, the injured victims, the innocent victims, will get a payout very quickly, as per usual, based on some basic investigation by the insurers. And the insurers will bicker with the possibly the responsible parties. It could be the vehicle manufacturer, it could be the infrastructure maintenance authorities behind the scene. when the consumer is out of the way. And that's basically to imbue confidence in the market among consumers, not very different from what we have today. So that's the third piece of regulation. The fourth one is actually type approval and certification. We think about all these things, whether they are pods running on pavements, pods running on roads, or level 4 vehicles running on public roads. They have to be type approved and certified before they can be road legal. At the moment, that is a big area, and there are no answers yet because the international community, particularly at UNEC in Geneva, are thrashing out what it means to certify software, what it means to certify systems, because no longer are we certifying just a vehicle and its roadworthiness. So that's the fourth piece. And the last one, not very different from what my colleagues have alluded to as well, driver licensing, repurposing future driving tests, and what does it mean to have a driver's license in the future? So 5 particular areas of regulation.
Very helpful, thank you.
Okay, Assemblymember Copley, you wanted to come in?
I think I'm all right.
Okay.
Actually, I could cover some next.
Assemblymember Cartley, you want to come in?
Just on that, one of the last points about insurance and a single insurer model. Presumably, if a privately owned automated vehicle, autonomous vehicle, is not serviced regularly or is not fixed when required, then that does put onus back on the owner.
Correct.
Or the driver. Is it the case that autonomous vehicles at level 4 and 5 will not move if there are repairs? Because I'm assuming once they get to that stage, they self-diagnose anyway. I'm just wondering how that would work.
In the bill, and we are basically taking a cue from the VTA bill previously, there is a section on contributory negligence. But of course, if the owner contributed to the malfunctioning of the system, then of course he will invalidate his insurance policy. Then of course you mentioned about should the vehicle function if indeed it has not been properly maintained. If it's a safety critical fault, it is conceivable that there will be warnings built in to warn the owner or the driver that you must perform the necessary maintenance or bring it to a workshop or have a repairer come and repair it before it can be driven, if it's safety critical, if it's really a matter of life and death. But of course, if it's not really safety critical, for example, brake fluid is running low, it's not inconceivable that you can still drive the vehicle, but you are given the advice to bring it into a workshop as quickly as possible. So there is a distinction between what's safety critical and what's not safety critical. And similarly, in the bill, there will be mention about software updates. So bearing in mind that these vehicles are essentially replete with software and complex computer systems, it is important for the user to regularly update the software when prompted to do so, particularly if these are safety critical patches to be applied to the software.
Thank you. Assemblymember Bailey.
Moving on to question 3.
Yep.
Okay. Morning. I just want to talk about will AVs contribute to a reduction in traffic? Because there's some tension around if we can drive more easily because we're not actually doing the driving, will we do more driving? And obviously London's a very congested place. Our population is, 8.6 million, and we're set to go to 10. So where do you see AVs contributing to a reduction in traffic, if possible? Sorry, to start with the Gateway project, sorry.
Oh, so I've written a sort of hierarchy of possible ways of managing congestion associated with AVs, and I'd say, it links into London's transport strategy, that you have to start by making the streets friendly, so people can walk and cycle in them. Because if they're not friendly, then they're going to choose other ways of getting around. Secondly, we should be extending cycling schemes to support assisted mobility, so that people who currently feel that it's hard work can get that support to move into more physical activity as they get around. Autonomous vehicles should be integrated into the public transport network, because if you don't integrate them into the public transport network, then people will find that the benefits that they're getting in their private vehicles are not being provided in public transport. Next, we have to develop a range of different sized AVs so that you're not just everybody getting into a 4-seater AV taxi when actually they don't need a 4-seater. They just need a little get around. I mean, if you go to India, you go around the world, you see little tuk-tuks, little 2-seater vehicles. Imagine some smaller vehicles like that acting as taxis rather than our large black cabs. Integrate sharing into AV technology from the start. I mean, that, you know, if you imagine that every vehicle, whether it's publicly owned or privately owned, can be shared easily, then that's going to reduce the number of vehicles that are parked on our streets. And then consider how we might integrate goods movement and people movement into the same vehicles, so that you start to have multi-purpose vehicles on the streets. During peak time, they might be moving people around. Other times at night, low congestion area times, they might be moving goods around. So that's a sort of hierarchy to try and help.
Just to go back to this thing about the non-owner, leasing a vehicle. It sounds very nice, and you have large parts of London where people, councils, whatever, through planning, don't build any parking. But we have a massive population, and if this is going to be any significant part of our transport needs, where will we park these autonomous vehicles?
Well, the theory is that if you have shared vehicles, you're going to have less of them. So, I mean, I've included a few diagrams in this document showing how, when you change the size of vehicles, when you change the amount of sharing that happens with vehicles, you can actually reallocate areas of the street that are currently used for parking vehicles that are sitting there for 24 hours or 23 hours a day for other uses. AVs do not have to park outside your door to be useful. I mean, they can be garaged.
They'll be parked outside someone's door. Someone is going to need to look after that vehicle. I'm assuming it'll all be electric. Who's plugging it in? Who's maintaining?
So all of those challenges need to be thought about. How, if we have, for example, at the moment, many local authorities have car sharing areas. So they'll have a row of car parking spaces available for car share clubs to park their cars. So imagine that those areas have charging points that are perhaps induction based, so that you don't have to plug them in. They just you sit your car on them and it charges the vehicle. Those cars are serviced, are looked after, so people will probably maintain them. So I can imagine, think about the car club model, but extend it, and think very, very carefully about how AVs integrate with large public transport interchanges, because at the moment our public transport interchanges have a lot of problems with huge queues of taxis waiting to pick people up, and it's not properly built into the system.
I just want to completely support your vision, and this is sort of what I'm thinking about when you think about public versus privately owned AVs. So if you're interested in reading more about it, we had a roundtable discussion organised by the OECD in Ottawa last year, and there is a publication with some work from myself, UCL, etc., regarding increasing shared use of AVs. And on the one hand, it's about how it would be good to have shared AVs, but on the other hand, it's like, well, how do we actually encourage the public to use them? So there's things like the fact that normally, at the moment, a lot of people use their cars just because of habit. So making the people understand that actually if they just drop that habit and be able to car share, it will reduce the number of privately owned vehicles. What will make us car share? Things like if it's comfortable, if it's low cost, if it reduces our time, if it's with people we like, if it has connection, etc., etc. And there's lots of suggestions of how we can increase the use of these publicly owned shared automated vehicles. And that's what a city or a government needs to look into, to educate the public, to make, and also to hear from the public what they want. So Uber is a very good example where it's what we wanted as citizens. Now, unfortunately, according to a DFT report a couple of years ago, it's increased privately owned vehicles, Ubers, 25% in London, and possibly therefore the emissions. So on the one hand, it's a good example that we as members of the public want that. On the other hand, if it's not managed and we don't use it as a sharing piece of travel, then it will increase congestion. So it's back to the cities helping these sorts of highly automated shared vehicles. What does the public want? A disabled person, it sounds really lovely, but if I can't see where it is, if I can't get into it because I can't see or I have mobility problems, then I'm not going to use it. Well, then let's develop systems and that will help the disabled person. So at the moment, it's all very kind of high level. It comes and gets you and goes somewhere.
But there's a lot in between.
We need to work on that. So we need the connectivity, we need the charging, we need the infrastructure, etc. So those are the things. So at the moment, it's lots of talking about this could happen, but we are now in a situation where a city can say, this is how we're going to make it happen. We're going to invest in this infrastructure. We're going to educate. We're going to provide connection. We're going to provide the right apps, whatever it might be.
And just to David and Rob, is there a technical challenge around reducing congestion? Because reading these notes, some say it will reduce congestion on the road between 50 and 250% because of how we can stack cars together, train them, whatever. And we've just had a conversation about inductive charging, but will all cars use the same systems? Do we need regulations to suggest you have to use this kind of system, excuse me, to operate with our cars? That's why we won't get that uplift, will we?
I think there's a number of elements to this, and I would kind of summarise it down to displacement rather than incremental. I think if we start introducing these additional services, which I think are absolutely the way we should be going as a city for London, if they become incremental to the current levels of traffic, then we will make things worse. I mean, I think TfL today does an amazing job managing traffic and managing congestion given the volumes of traffic that it has. I mean, if they turned off their kind of real-time traffic optimization capability that they do, I mean, we'd have gridlock very, very quickly. So they're already managing a known problem, but I think a lot of the research that's available shows that for the private vehicles going around London at any point in time, 3/4 of the time, they're actually looking for a parking space. So actually these are journeys rather than services. So you've got buses and taxis providing services in the city, and then you've got private cars typically doing a journey. Well, if you could start to displace journeys with incremental services, you might actually end up with less vehicles. Or coming back to your point about where are these going to be parked, ideally they don't park. They keep moving and they're continuing to provide services. I mean, clearly they will need maintenance and they will need to be shut off at some point for charging and other such things. But generally speaking, it's a bit like taxis, where you don't really want them sitting on ranks too long. You want them conducting services on behalf of the general public. And I think, you know, we will see an incremental challenge to start with, but a very quick shift towards displacement.
3 quick answers in the interest of time. Firstly, a Department for Transport Commission study published earlier this year shows that the modelling undertaken on urban roads with peak traffic and low numbers of autonomous vehicles, this is not London, but they did the modelling, showed that there could be up to 12% reduction in delays and an increase of 21% in journey time reliability. So this was a study published by DFT, which they commissioned Atkins to undertake. Secondly, the vision of the automotive industry of future is ACES. ACES Go Places. That's ACES, ACES. Autonomous, connected, electrified, and shared. In terms of shared, We think that in the first instance, it will be in the urban context, in urban environment. As my colleagues alluded to, these would mean basically higher utilization rate, higher occupancy rate, and by implication, all ceteris paribus, all things constant, there would be fewer cars on the road. And we hear from the amazing work that TfL has done, and we also hear from them that basically one shared vehicle takes away about 8 to 10 privately owned vehicles on the road. But what is critical is that what our members, the vehicle manufacturer members, have experienced in terms of running car sharing services. They've been telling us that actually because of the fragmentation of the boroughs in London and sometimes conflicting priorities, they have run into various stumbling blocks in terms of deploying car sharing services. And one of them have actually exited the London market, exited UK altogether a few years ago for largely the same reasons. They just couldn't make car sharing work despite how promising car sharing services are because of conflicting priorities of some of these London boroughs. So perhaps the committee may wish to look into that matter a little bit further. And thirdly, lastly, really when we talk about future transport technology and alleviating congestion, it's not just all about autonomous vehicles. Autonomous or not, what's quite important is to have some distributed digital platforms to enable people to know that essentially where I should go at what sort of time. Perhaps diversions will tell you basically this particular route is heavily congested, take this one. But you need that in real time, and you need to bring all the modes of transport together, all the different types of transport together, and put it in the hands of the consumer, empower the consumer to make the decision. We don't have that currently. So that all-encompassing digital platform to enable distributed system, which the transport systems catapult would call intelligent mobility, I think is quite critical, whether it's autonomous or not.
And just one final point, Chair. It's interesting reading the Royal College of Arts study and reading the public's hopes and fears, because they're two sides of the same coin. But there's things in here like the loss of jobs and skills. People are worried about that. Bus drivers, cab drivers, their livelihoods going away. People are saying their cities will grow because as we get used to what's termed a useful journeys, I can write in the back of the car because I'm not driving. And the thing that's troubling me the most, though, is the transition, it says here, transition to single surface roadways, because as cars become autonomous or whatever, or buses, whatever, we won't have that distinction between a curb or not and the issues that might generate for people. And there's a human element here as well, because it says eye contact can't be made with an autonomous car, because oftentimes you won't step off the curb until that driver has acknowledged you. Are these just behaviour changes, or will there be some losers from this utopia of moving towards autonomous vehicles? We'll start with Dan.
I think these are, we see hopes and fears as challenges and opportunities for the industry and for the public and for politicians and for everybody engaged in this field to come up with solutions. So rather than ignoring people's hopes or ignoring people's fears, we actually use these as the basis of our design development. And the more that we can share these, this knowledge with the industry and with other stakeholders, the better. But I see a great, as I say, I see a great opportunity to create a calmer and more people-centred city. But there are challenges on the way, and we have to take into account everybody's point of view.
Do any of our guests see that these autonomous vehicles could affect the physical layout of our roads, our city, our streets? Because currently we talk about healthy streets, and we're sort of making a push to make walking and cycling safer. Will autonomous cars support that, or will they challenge that?
So I see them as supporting it, but I'm open to other
and on the eye contact, there's a new work being done by many of the manufacturers looking at external messaging, lights, etc., that will then interact instead of the driver inside. It's very much work in progress. It's a new ISO meeting has been set up on it, but they are becoming aware that actually there needs to be some communication externally with people to say, I've noticed you, or I'm going to stop, or whatever, to replace the driver inside.
Okay, thank you.
If I can very briefly add just one final point on that, I think from a TRL perspective, we're doing quite a lot of work on this transition away from the human driver looking through a safety critical device called the windscreen and being informed of traffic lights, road signs and so on towards connected vehicles. So not so much complete automation necessarily, but the vehicle itself being a lot more informed electronically, so that you can actually start to completely rethink the street furniture around the vehicle, whether it's pavement structures, whether it's the concept of a red traffic light. A red traffic light is really there more to tell a driver to stop. But actually, if the vehicle already knows it needs to stop electronically, why have a red traffic light?
Although those traffic lights are also for pedestrians and for cyclists. So
absolutely.
I don't think we're going to get rid of transport infrastructure.
But because that's where the tension lies, that sort of
over time.
Yeah.
where you as a human being has to interact with this thing that you're not aware of. It may have all the information in the world, but you have none of it, and there's a tension there, isn't it? And also the technical challenge: how are you going to go to several different manufacturers and make sure they all respond to the system that we put in London? Because we may have one traffic light, but if you build cars internationally, you're going to have to build cars specifically for our market, which may be a trouble.
And that's where standards come in.
The type approval and so on, yes.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Shah.
Thank you, Chair. I want to raise the topic of transport inequality. Already, Mr. Phillips, you mentioned community buses. You also referred to assistance for older disabled people and connectivity in terms of transport deserts. Can we start with overarching question, and that is, will AV technology help to combat transport inequality in London?
Can do. If we design the systems right, and if the technologists get the price right, and that the system actually is designed to engage with people who are currently excluded for whatever reason. So, it can improve accessibility because it can bring the right vehicle to you rather than leave you stranded. It can reduce the cost per mile for passengers and for service providers, and it can reach areas that are currently underserved.
There is the issue about better access. Both you're talking about connectivity for those areas which are not adequately served, as well as it's about benefits for older and disabled people. Now, can you sort of enlarge upon that? Because in your paper as well, you mentioned those 2 or 3 critical areas. Because obviously, with innovation, with modern technology, you would have better vehicles which should provide better accessibility, whether it is, for example, somebody in wheelchair or older people who would have probably better facilities, should have better facilities from more modern sort of vehicles. Will there be a major change in those terms with AV technology?
If we separate out AV technology, which is the technology that drives cars around, and that you can call to you, and that you can then get into and use. The technology has to be inclusive, so you have to be able to engage with it, no matter your physical abilities. So that's a sort of starting point, isn't it? And then in terms of the actual physical shape and design of the vehicles. Again, there's a big move in the motoring industry to design for more inclusivity. But I think that actually we need to go even further than we have already. And I think that because of the fact that you don't need to actually steer a vehicle, I think you'll end up providing more mobility, better mobility to people who are currently excluded. We've met with a lot of people with disabilities who are actually very, very excited about this independence that they currently lack. But I think there's a whole area of study to go into in terms of what does inclusive autonomous transport look like in London. We're actually doing a project with the RAC Foundation with some of our first year students to sort of investigate that in more detail at the moment. So,
Yeah.
Can I just add something? So at the moment, these vehicles need nice straight sections of road with nice white lines that they follow or to be mapped in particular areas. So in terms of this sort of transport deserts, I guess, yes, the answer is it can do, but it needs the infrastructure to do it. So that's the main key. If it is the wish that the vehicle is basically put somewhere where at the moment nothing else can move, hoping that the people who are sort of, in terms of inter-urban areas, at the moment they are stuck there because of lack of infrastructure, then at the moment and for the foreseeable futures, these vehicles will not be able to help those people either. So it is around the infrastructure, the connectivity being in place, and yes, then they can do.
Generally, if you're interested in some figures, we commissioned a study conducted by PricewaterhouseCoopers earlier this year on the impact of connected and autonomous vehicles. We say connected and autonomous because obviously for people with limited mobility, they need some sort of connectivity before they could hail these services. So connected and autonomous vehicles on sections of society with limited mobility, i.e. The aged, the infirm, people with disabilities, and the very young. So some salient findings here. 6 in 10 people with limited mobility say that they foresee higher quality of life thanks to connected and autonomous vehicles technology. Half with mobility-related disabilities say that they could pursue hobbies outside home thanks to connected and autonomous vehicles. And 2 in 5 believe that they will get better access to healthcare as a result of connected and autonomous vehicles. Quite interestingly, 47% of older people believe that connected and autonomous vehicles will help them more easily fulfill day-to-day tasks, simple day-to-day tasks like grocery shopping.
Mr. Wallace, do you want to come in?
I think my colleagues have probably covered most of it here. I'd come back to this point, I suppose, about the difference between products and services. I think we've talked a lot about autonomous vehicle products and the technology. But for me, the answer really is services. And increasingly, we're seeing cities around the world start to look at this as not the introduction of technology products, which is perhaps where the automotive industry has in the past come from traditionally in terms of manufacturing and releasing new products that can do better things. But cities are looking more at how they create services to meet the needs of all of the different types of citizens within that city, whether those are some of those with the challenges that we've talked about. What I'm encouraged by is actually the way the automotive industry in recent couple of years has shifted dramatically its own focus towards services as well as just manufacturing and selling products. And I think we're seeing a very strong convergence between the two now. I think from a city like London, to make sure the services that it starts to create and evolve and allow over time through licensing and other such instruments, it just needs to make sure that the accessibility agenda becomes a key part of that licensing decision, and it's not just the commercial benefits to the organisations that come in and provide those services that are driving the agenda, but actually the kind of social inclusion part of it is balanced as part of that.
What is unclear at the moment is about the cost, because from the information we have, it seems that the experts, as well as various studies that are made, do not quite indicate whether AV will be cheaper or it will be more expensive than cars currently are. Are there any studies done whether we are able to assess what the cost implications will be, or likely to be?
think if I can make an observation, a recent meeting I had with Google and the team looking at their autonomous vehicle program, they've been looking very much at the unit cost of introducing autonomy into vehicles. They've actually recently decided to move away from a concept of developing their own vehicle and are pushing more towards selling an autonomous system to the automotive industry. And other technology companies are doing very similar things. They've been looking at the unit cost of all of the technology that goes into a vehicle. In particular, the concept of a LiDAR device that typically is on the roof of a number of these Google vehicles. You may have seen the picture, a lot of the kit that goes on the roof. They've managed to reduce the unit cost of that within 12 months by 90%. So to the speed of innovation in the technology is absolutely driving down the unit costs of all of this technology very fast. So today I think it's financially prohibitive to really look at buying a large number of these to operate a fleet. But 5 years from now, that commercial proposition is going to be very, very different.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So finally, if we go to Assemblyman McCartney, please.
Yeah, can I just ask firstly though about the infrastructure requirements, and perhaps I could start with David. You talked about car sharing companies often finding that they couldn't perhaps get necessary parking spaces in a local authority and so forth. And obviously if this has got to work, we've got to have the infrastructure there. As far as the car manufacturers are concerned, is there a common infrastructure that's required? You talked about induction charging earlier, because if you look at these things, you know, you could have X number of chargers needed depending on your particular model. So is there a common requirement that's being developed amongst all manufacturers?
Yes. I think we need to separate the two issues here. One is on electrification, and the other is obviously on connected and autonomous vehicles. Of course, in electrification, there's a whole debate out there about different standards, interoperability of charging infrastructure, so on and so forth. But if we leave that aside and look at autonomous vehicles, certainly, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of car sharing services, autonomous or not. Obviously, there's infrastructure is needed, i.e. parking. And that's what some of our vehicle manufacturer members running car sharing services currently in London have come into quite a number of stumbling blocks, if you like, with the boroughs on that. But going forward, in terms of infrastructure, one that is really of concern to the industry at the moment is connectivity. Maybe it's not such a huge concern in London because you've got great connectivity in central London, maybe pockets of greater London, perhaps there may be some issues. But certainly we see this as an issue outside London, particularly on the pockets of the strategic road network, the motorways, and more on the A roads and the B roads. And I'm talking about digital connectivity, telecoms connectivity. Although autonomous vehicles can actually, in theory, function without any connectivity, but we believe, in industry, we believe that connectivity complements autonomy. So a vehicle with its combination of sensor fusion and its artificial intelligence system can drive itself, but can perceive and can process and then make a decision. We believe that actually if it knows what's around the corner, because something is telling the vehicle that a car is running the lights, jumping the red lights around the corner, it could actually take evasive action, whether it's autonomously braking or basically it just does something that avoid a collision. So connectivity matters. But what we're saying is that this digital infrastructure is lacking generally in the UK because strictly speaking, on UK roads, only 48% of the entire UK road network have complete 3G coverage, 18% 4G, and that's not quite good enough. But obviously, if you're talking about London, central London, I believe the rates are higher. The connectivity and coverage is much better. But that's something that is really central. And the other thing is, of course, in the first instance, for these vehicles to be able to perceive the road, white lines are quite important. as well as some of the physical infrastructure. Of course, we're talking about moving eventually to completely digital, whereby the speed limit could be transmitted by local authorities or Highways England digitally into the cars. That will be a possibility somewhere down the line, but in the first instance, white lines and road signages are quite important.
And so TfL and local authorities have a big role to play in this infrastructure, even in London, which is relatively well connected. And do you get the sense that TfL is playing that role currently? I don't know who wants to.
Yes, if I can comment on that. I mean, I think there's the role that TfL is playing in supporting, for example, a number of the initiatives that TRL and the Royal College of Art and other organisations are working on for trials and research, but also the work they're doing on electrification, their participation in the Zeus project, the European Commission project looking at electrification of buses and induction charging solutions for buses. So I think there's a whole range of different initiatives. I think some of the new plans going forwards, I think you may be aware of work that BEIS and the Department for Transport is doing through Innovate UK to introduce the concept of living lab test environments. And there is a proposal for a London-based smart mobility living lab, which is currently being considered by central government at the moment. And TfL is a key player in that, kind of sponsoring that from not a financial perspective, but from a stakeholder point of view, so that we can create a real-life test environment, predominantly around Greenwich, but not exclusively. It's really for the whole of London, to really try out a number of these new technologies and these new services. It's very much about services and not just around the technical products themselves.
Okay, then if I can go on to bus services, can you just explain to me what are the potential benefits of autonomous buses for London, and what are the barriers and risks in rolling these out? Rob, do you want to start?
I think we know there's already some significant challenges in London of any large kind of heavy vehicle in particular, whether it's trucks or buses, in relation to vulnerable road users, cyclists and pedestrians in particular. So a lot of work is being done to improve the safety, particularly the line of sight of bus drivers and truck drivers, to be more spatially aware of what's going on around them so that they can drive more defensively. I think the introduction of greater levels of automation and driver assist, or indeed potentially no driver, can only improve the safety aspects of that over time once those technical solutions are proven and robust and licensed. I think one of the downsides of that, of course, is what does that mean for all of these bus drivers currently operating in London? So I think there's a job transition downside to this, but that's arguably the same with any similar service. I think there was an interesting statistic out of the US market where I think the single most prolific job title of any career whatsoever across the whole of the US includes the word driver. And the introduction of autonomy could suddenly have a massive economic issue for any country or any city embarking on levels of automation. And that's obviously not just for transportation, that's the same with any kind of robotic type scenario.
Okay. Anyone else want to talk about the benefits and risks?
I just wanted to add to sort of, I guess again it depends on what level of automation we're talking about. So if we're talking about the sort of the lower levels of automation, 1 and 2, that will assist the bus driver in being a better driver, then that we can see that coming soon. But I assume that we're going to see a very different kind of automated bus, smaller perhaps, like you were saying, lighter, so that when it crashes into vulnerable road users, it's not as bad as the current ones. And I just keep thinking about my colleagues in aviation saying, well, we still have pilots in the cockpit after all these years of aviation. So I'm not sure whether I fully see that suddenly all bus drivers are going to lose their jobs in the sort of next 20 or so years at least. They'll just maybe have a different kind of job, but we'll still need humans to watch the systems, even if we manage to get as sophisticated as aeroplanes, where, as I say, there are still pilots in there. They might not do much, but they are still in there to make sure everything is working. So I see that model is probably more likely.
So a driver more focused on customer service, for example, as opposed to the vehicle or so
Sorry,
forth.
can you...
Sorry, so a driver more focused on customer service as opposed to
Absolutely, and I think
necessarily-
we just have to wait and see how things develop, for sure. And you know, jobs do change as well. So, you know, we sort of, in terms of when horses were changed for cars, people will change accordingly. So I think, you know, there will be, in the longer term, there will be a need for a different kind of service by us as human beings, but it doesn't mean that we suddenly lose lots of jobs and the economy is affected.
Okay, and I don't know, Rob, whether you can tell me whether, you talked earlier about what TfL is doing for autonomous buses. Could you give a little bit more detail about what perhaps they are doing and what should they be doing that they're not doing at the moment?
Oh gosh, I think they're doing a lot of things, and I mean, there's always, I guess, a desire to go faster, but there's always the challenge that, you know, should TfL as a public service organisation be funding initiatives, or should it be creating an environment where industry, at its cost, can come and trial things? And I think this concept of living lab, which you know, hopefully is going to be set up in London, and there's a similar one predominantly focused around the automotive industry in the Midlands, where that's very much an industry funding things and coming and paying to play. And in the case of London, TfL and the local authorities involved, providing an environment where they can play safely. And play is probably not the right word, but I think you know what I mean. So I see them playing a very critical enabling role, not a funding role, except for where it's specifically relating to buses and bus services. And I think they've already, again, tried to find ways of participating without doing things specifically for London. So the Zeus project is in fact with 12 different cities across EU member states. So there's an element of sharing the benefits and sharing the costs of being involved in such programs.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That's been a really interesting first session, and thank you for enlightening us. What I will say is thanks for your time. We'll now ask you to leave, and we'll get the second panel in, and very grateful to you for having come and spent the time with us today. While we're doing that, I'll just do a few of the bits and pieces on the agenda while the committee clerks change the slides. Okay, so first one is item number 5. Sorry. Item number 6, sorry. It is reports on bus services. So we need to note this report driven to distraction, making London buses safer, as agreed by the chairman under delegated authority in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And then we also need to note its report, London Bus Network, as agreed by the chairman under delegated authority in consultation with the deputy chair and party group leads. Okay. Number 7, door-to-door services. The committee has recommended to note the response from Transport for London to its report, door-to-door transport in London, delivering a user-led service. Is that noted?
Noted.
And we need to note the impact review for the report. Item number 8, Outer London Junctions. The committee has recommended to note the scope and terms of reference of the rapporteurship investigation into Outer London Junctions being led by Caroline Russell, and agreed to delegate authority to the chairman in consultation with the deputy chair and party group leads to agree the final report of the investigation. Is that agreed? Marvellous. Number 9, London Travel Watch Chair. Delighted to say that we have now appointed the Travel Watch Chair, and that the committee has recommended to note the appointment of Arthur Lefley as Chair of the Board of London Travel Watch for a term of 4 years, commencing from the 1st of October 2017, and to note the Secretary of State has confirmed he's satisfied for Arthur Leafley to serve as the London representative on the Board of Transport Focus, and accordingly to agree appointment of Arthur Leafley as a member of Transport Focus. Is that agreed? Thank you. Well, then we'll just, at this point, finish with doing the work programme. The committee has recommended to agree its work programme 2017-18 Assembly year, including the schedule of prospective topics for forthcoming meetings set out in paragraph 4.19. Agreed. Note the impact review of its report on traffic congestion. Agreed. Noted, sorry. And note its response to the recent Transport for London consultation on Oxford Street, which was agreed under delegated authority by the Chairman in consultation with the Deputy Chair and Party Group leads. Thank you. Oh, no, two more. We need to agree to visit a national rail station to consider accessibility issues for disabled people, and to delegate authority to the Chairman in consultation with the Deputy Chairman and Party Group leads to agree the details of the visit.
Agreed.
And note the record of its site visit to Liverpool Street Station as set out in Appendix 3.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. That's given us enough time to do anything. If our next set of guests would like to come and join us, please. The entrance over there. We've got Chris Lane, Brian Matthews, Professor Maria Carmagiani and John Elledge. Sorry, well, we are probably running a little bit late, but I think you'll agree that it's quite an interesting session we had earlier. So if I could welcome Chris Lane from, you're the Head of Smart Travel and Transport for West Midlands.
That's right, thank you.
Brian Matthews is Head of Transport Innovation for Milton Keynes Council.
That's right, thank you.
Professor Maria Carmagiani, is that close enough? From the University College London, and John Elledge of City Metrics. Thank you very much for giving us your time this morning. Very kind of you. And I shall start the questions with Mr. Lane. Chris, let's just... Autonomous vehicles. I'll start with Chris. Based on evidence heard in the previous session, I don't know if you were here.
Heard some of that, yes.
What are the potential risks and benefits of autonomous vehicles for London?
I think you had a really good discussion about autonomous vehicles earlier. Benefits can be, the big one for autonomous vehicles is safety. So potentially, if that's done right, you can improve safety. If autonomous vehicles are auto-electric vehicles, which is a big debate in itself, then that helps in terms of congestion, pollution. If autonomous vehicles are running correctly in terms of road space, you can get more vehicles on the road. But again, I think from a London perspective, it's working out how that fits in with your mass transit system and making sure that autonomous vehicles don't detract from the really good work that's already happened to carry Londoners around in a very efficient way that you do at the moment. So they do have some advantages, but potentially if they become very popular and very cheap, they could detract from your mass transit systems as well.
Thank you. In addition to that, Brian, you've got specific knowledge in Milton Keynes. You did a trial with autonomous vehicles, so could you add that knowledge?
Yes, in Milton Keynes we're leading on the Autodrive project, which is probably one of the largest of the tests going on in the UK at the moment. We're 2 years into that project, but we've set the context of what we wanted to achieve in Milton Keynes very much to look at the technology and what it can achieve for our city. Milton Keynes, as you probably know, is a growing city. We're due to double in size over the next 20 years. If we continue as we are, we're going to suffer from terrible congestion, air quality issues, etc., and mobility issues. So we've set the demonstration trials in Milton Keynes to start to look to address them. What is the value in autonomy and connected vehicles in helping solve some of our problems or forecast problems? They're not going to solve all of them, but we've concentrated very much on congestion and capacity issues in our network. We know we can't double the size of the road network, but we're doubling the size of travel demand. So what is the real capacity benefits, improved capacity that the networks can realistically gain from automation? And what's the timeline for achieving that? And are there some pain points that we'll have to go through to get to that end goal? So the tests are very much looking at those. We're also very much looking at the last mile solution. I heard the debate earlier about the right size of vehicles. So that's why we've chosen in our city centre to operate pods on pavements, to have small door-to-door services that can meet a specific demand to increase connectivity and mobility within our city centre. And finally, we're looking at two other areas: productivity. What time can you can do something else while you're in the vehicle? You're not sat in a traffic jam having to control the vehicle. And as any authority, we're interested in the mobility aspects. What mobility options does autonomous vehicles create for the young and old who perhaps choose not to drive or don't want to drive, or we have legislation that prevents them from driving because they're under 17. So we focused our project very much on looking at the real problems that the city faces.
Interesting. Would you like to add anything to that?
Sorry?
Would you like to add anything to that?
So I agree with Chris and Brian, and I want to focus especially on that with autonomous vehicles, citizens could use their travel time more productively, so they can have a positive utility of their travel time. We have seen this with recent research we conducted at UCL for public transport users. When they work, when they watch movies, while traveling with public transport, this increases their satisfaction. So with autonomous vehicles, there's no need to drive, so we can improve our travel time, the quality of our travel time, and also our life.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything, John?
Well, in contrast to the rest of the panel, I don't really know a great deal. I'm basically just a shouty-go of a blog. So I'm going to do little more than regurgitate things that clever people have said that I've read, I suspect, and I'm going to be rather better at posing questions than answering them. But nonetheless, there are a number of questions that I've come across that I think are worth considering. One which is induced traffic is a real phenomenon. I would be slightly concerned that I'm sure we've all had the experience of apps like Waze or something like that where they kind of direct you a slightly longer route than normal in pursuit of marginal gains in journey time. So I would worry slightly that, you know, the more autonomous vehicles there are on the roads, the more those vehicles are going to be sort of going long way round. So obviously there are implications there for congestion, etc. I think also there are some of the ethical concerns or unintended consequences of things that are not going to be clear until we have autonomous vehicles on a large scale. So one of the pieces we published quite early in City Metrics history, which did very well for us, was a piece talking about, you know, if a car on a very narrow road is about to run over a child, there has to be some programming as to what the response is. Do you kill the child or do you kill the driver? Someone has to make those decisions. And, you know, maybe it's a tech firm, maybe it's a political decision, I don't know, but this is something that I think has to be, there are all sorts of consequences. Or to make it less, that's quite a sinister way of putting it. If you think of it differently, you can imagine a situation in which it becomes a game in which kids basically try and stop autonomous vehicles by just throwing a ball in front of them or something. Until this stuff is happening at large scale, I almost don't think we know exactly what it's going to look like in practice, and this kind of needs to be, you need to be thinking about this stuff up front, but I don't think you can necessarily get to answers on it. The other thing, I think, from listening to the debate so far, I think it sounds a lot like we're kind of assuming full autonomy, and obviously there are sort of different levels of these things. And as I understand it, sort of fully autonomous vehicles in which you can basically sit there and watch a movie and let the car get on with it is known as level 5. But there are a number of steps to get us to that. And it seems to me more likely that in the medium term, at least, we're going to be talking about largely autonomous vehicles, but where occasionally someone has to step in. That obviously brings up all sorts of questions as to how you sort of manage that transition too. So as I warned at the beginning, I fear I'm asking far more questions than actually providing answers, but nonetheless there are some questions to come.
So Brian, you want to come back?
Sorry, I was just going to make a point on the productivity that was raised earlier. We've concluded a national survey on that, and the expectation was that you're going to use the time to do all sorts of things, but the big response was we do nothing while we're in the vehicle, or we'd look out of the window. That was 70% of the responses. So you do get some surprises from all the technology. You can watch films, you can do that, you can play with the email, but people want to do nothing sometimes.
That's interesting, very interesting. Assemblymember Russell.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm going to move us on to talk about apps, the stuff that we've got on our phones that help us all get around the city. We're all used to using City Mapper, which is completely incredible. You know, you can even, it does it by time of day, and it knows when the trains start and stop running, and it's, you know, hugely helpful if you're trying to get around a city, particularly for those, you know, for A to B type journeys. But there are other apps that are offering kind of services that you pay for, so like Uber and the various bike hire apps. And so those are selling one particular service for one particular company rather than offering you a choice like some of the apps like Citymapper or Google Maps would offer you choices of different ways of making your journey from A to B. So it's a general question for all of you. In what ways have smartphone apps transformed transport in London, and where do you think this technology can go next? Who wants to go first?
Would you like me to start?
With you,
Can I first of all say, I think the work from TfL has done a lot to help this market. I think the excellent work on open APIs to allow that data to be used, the excellent work on providing real-time bus, tram, train information has actually stimulated this market. It's probably seen as the world leader in providing this type of information. So I think you've only got Citymapper because of the good work the guys at TfL have done to get that data to them. That being said, one of the implications for apps is that data is now, Citymapper's data are not Transport for London's data. So the data about the customer, the information that's gathered, that insight, has now, if you like, is one step removed from the people that actually could do something to influence the transport. So I suppose the big thing for me with apps is to try and make them a bit more open, a bit more give and take. So yes, the authority has got lots of very good information from highways to transit, but they should also be getting back the information from the app providers as to where people go, what they do, what their choices are, so that can better inform the whole of the transport network. I think it will probably come up later. I'd like to talk about Mobility as a Service as an app which brings together multiple providers, which we do.
It is coming up later.
Yes, so yeah. I think that will be one of the opportunities to talk about how you bring those variety of services together and those variety of apps together in one place to give the customer that sort of one-stop service.
Thank you.
I think our experience in Milton Keynes is very much what I think has just been introduced, the Mobility as a Service, and how we brought all the apps and information and data together into one hub, so there's one point of contact. I think the opportunity is now we're all very familiar with apps, everybody uses them, so it's about grasping that, and it's getting the data, the information, the usefulness of that app right first time, because the worst thing is you start using an app and it doesn't work, you'll not go back to that app and you'll wait for the next one. So it has to be timed correctly and be all-encompassing product. I think that's what Mobility as a Service and what we're trying to achieve. West Midlands are doing that. Milton Keynes are doing its own version.
So definitely all these smartphone based apps have contributed to an increase of public transport modes and active transport modes, because they provide better information, they provide real-time information We can see the location of the vehicles. We can estimate our waiting time. So this is something that it's very important for the user. There are a lot of amazing apps, journey planners, but then also each transport operator, each transport mode has its own app, and they do not, some of these apps collaborate. For example, Citymapper provides information about public transport modes, and Uber and bike sharing, but they do not still provide information about intermodal trips. So to have, in order to go from A to B, to combine bike sharing and then Uber or car sharing. So this is something that they are working on, but we need apps that provide intermodal information. And then nowadays the situation has started getting out of control. We have too many apps that provide different type of information. For example, if I want to use public transport, I will check Citymapper because it is amazing. It has all the features that you described previously. But if I want to use car sharing, then I have to separately check the Zipcar or the Drive Now or Enterprise apps. So we lose a lot of time searching all these different apps to find information. And in the end, we don't have all this time, so the choices we make are not that well informed. So it is probably time to initiate an integrator in the market, and in order to be able to find all this type of information, and probably also the ticketing, the payment, through one single interface.
Thank you. John, do you want to...
One thing I feel has not really come out yet is I feel something like Citymapper is something it provides very well is what one may term legibility. It can be very useful in terms of getting you around a city where you don't know way around. Now, London actually is pretty legible. I mean, like the tube map is an obvious example, but things like the bus spider maps, it's just, if you don't know your way around London, it's relatively, not easy, but there is information out there that can help you in a way that is often, sadly, not true in a lot of cities, especially British cities where the bus provision is so fragmented. So I think actually apps like that can probably be of greatest use elsewhere. I suspect within London it's probably a variant of that. It's going to sort of spread the load to less familiar forms of transport, because suddenly you can see that rather than taking the long way around by the tube, you can actually do it. You can get a bus or something. I don't know. But I suspect that the biggest impact will probably be on cities where the transport system is rather less advanced than the one in London.
Just to sort of dig back into the sort of public purpose that we can get from this app technology, it was either Chris or Brian, I'm sorry, I think it was Chris, who mentioned getting the data back once you've got these private app providers. TfL don't actually have access to that data. So is that a risk for TfL now in terms of planning for future transport need if they don't have that data coming back to them?
I think it is a risk, and I think it's very interesting. I think some of these companies might see it as their commercial intellectual property, that information they've gained, but at the end of the day, if there is an inefficient part of the transport system and you don't know about it, you can't do anything about it. Mm-hmm. That might be best filled with a new bus service. It might be that a company that knows this will fill that with taxis. So, you need to know that. London is such a busy place, such a lot of traffic, that you really do need to know that information. And not just London, it needs to be known commonly, I think, everywhere really. What you also don't know is you do know your public transport trips, but what these apps know is where somebody started from their home address to their final address. And that's also a really critical piece of information, because you don't know whether it's a good route to get somebody from their housing onto the transport network in the first place. How are they doing that? Are they doing that by taxi? Are they walking? Are they cycling? London have been actually very good at extracting some of this information from these companies. I think there's some been really good relationships built, but it's not by right that you get that information. It's almost by persuasion that you work in partnership with these companies to get that.
So is that something that TfL should be thinking about the contracts that they make in terms of giving, because they're very good at giving the data. The reason we've got so many good apps, things like Citymapper, is because they're good at sharing their data. So should they actually be sharing it on different terms?
I think that's a reasonable request with these organisations. I think I think it is the public sector's responsibility to provide good, high-quality data that can be commercialised then by the private sector. But the private sector knows about the way the transport network's working, and that should be optimised for everybody's benefit. It's a public good for everybody's benefit. How that happens in anonymised ways, I think it's important to capture that information.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Curtin.
Hello. So sticking with apps, I mean, they're fantastic for some things, but there have been some issues. Does the experience with apps like O-Bike and Uber suggest that app-based transport can have negative effects on the transport network in some cases? If you would like to, Chris.
Well, let's use our friends at Uber as a good example. So I don't think it's the app necessarily that's a problem. I'll give you a real Uber example from themselves. When you introduced the night tube, it decreased the number of Uber journeys in central London and actually increased their business on the periphery where those tubes terminated. So I think whether or not you're using an app, the quality of your mass transit system is critical, because people will choose an app if they haven't got something good to go to instead. So I think we need to be careful to not just blame the app, but we need to look at what's behind that and why people are choosing to use the app. What their motivation is to use an app rather than to use another form of transport.
I think the problems we've experienced in our city is the lack of comprehensive data. So, as I alluded to, if the data's not there that feeds the app, then they become disreputable and not used. And it comes to the point where they're actually not at all useful, and people are turned off, and they can have the negative effect. So having the appropriate, up-to-date, real-time data is crucially important, we feel. And we have deliberately delayed the launch of our city mapping app until we have that comprehensive data set, because we feel that we've only got one chance to launch it. If we launch it too early, it won't work, people will not think, and it won't influence behaviour change that we hope it will.
Yeah, okay. Anyone else like to comment?
I mean, I think there's an issue of externalities at times, in that my own personal experience of Uber often feels like there's so many Ubers on offer in central London where you have many other options, whereas if you're in the suburbs, when in fact it could often be the most useful out there, they can be relatively hard to come by and higher in price. And one of the reasons the company can get away with that oversupply in the more profitable part of town is it feels to me like they're not actually, they don't lose anything from that, like the risk is on the driver. Now, I don't instinctively know what the solution to that problem is. Hopefully O-Bike, there is obviously a similar externalities problem that it doesn't bother them if the bikes pile up in a place, and Wandsworth Council, I believe, dealt with it by just taking all the bikes away. So there are things you can do, but it just feels to me at the moment like Uber, the company, is not necessarily sharing in the downsides from an oversupply of Uber. I don't know what the solution to that is, but it does feel like there should be one.
It's the congestion side of things is something that people bring up as an issue quite a lot, because there's in London now 120,000 private hire drivers, approximately, which is a huge amount more. It's doubled, more than doubled, I think, in the last 10 years. And with O-Bike, there's people are suggesting there's congestion on the pavements. So that's an issue that some people are concerned about, as you sort of brought up there. But do any of you have any other ideas how that could be more effectively managed or regulated? Is it possible to do that, or? You know, is there any way to prevent the congestion issues that people talk about?
Well, the motion map we're developing for Milton Keynes is going to be predicated on the real-time information that's provided by a city-scale network of sensors. So in essence, our app will be driven by the busyness factors of all modes. So the sensors will cover buses, cycling, taxis, cars, pedestrians. And we'll use that information in real time. It's the information refreshed 3 times a minute to give advice to travellers to try to influence their behavioural choice. We'll tell them how busy certain networks, certain locations, certain systems are, and it's then their choice on how they undertake their journey. Do they undertake it at that time, or do they wait for a less busy time, because we can predict what will happen in the future. So it's very much predicated on real-time, live information that's transmitted through a city-scale sensor network. So that again, that's my point, that until we're ready to deploy that sensors, which is currently being built out, we're not going to launch our app because of the credibility issues.
Okay.
If I could just come back on certainly the public transport side, you did some good work during the 2012 Olympics, where you adjusted travel patterns to meet different demands. TfL did that through their journey planning app. And I think it's, again, this feedback loop with these companies to understand where their customers are and where Uber are putting their cars. At the moment, you don't know, so you can't have that conversation. And I think having the data and knowing where these bikes are, or these cars are, or these shared buses are, allows you to have that conversation with these companies.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Assemblyman Bailey, you want to come in?
Just to put this to Chris. Hello, Chris. Is there there's definitely a tension between giving the companies the data and getting it back, but if we control it too centrally, could we stifle innovation? Would that stop companies entering the market, providing something new? Is there a risk there?
So I think what TfL have done is enabled innovation by the way they've approached this. So, but that comes with a few consequences, which is probably where we are today. But I don't think it's unreasonable to now ask or even require those companies to start providing basic information back to the authority, because I think that helps everybody. And if you speak to them all individually, they were all saying, we want to improve general transport because that means that's better for our customers. If they create congestion, they create slower trips, they've got less business. If they've got a good functioning London transport network, then everybody wins. But at the moment, they, I think, like the public transport industry a few years ago, think there's value in this data, and they're holding on to it, and they're holding tight. It's not just the likes of Uber. I mean, Google as well, and people like that have lots of location data. What's happening to it, and why can't the public authority have that in an anonymised form? So we don't want to know the individual customers. That allows the authority to better plan and better run the whole transport network.
To me, it doesn't sound unreasonable at all, and it's a shame we didn't think about that at the front end, so we're not where we are. Because it sounds to me, if you compare our situation with Milton Keynes, it sounds like Milton Keynes have more central control and therefore can manipulate it in ways they want to manipulate it. Is that something that we would like in London, and is this a tactic to help that happen?
I think actually London are in a better position, because for the majority of certainly public transport, you've got control over that, and so you've got a big proportion of that. You've got a stronger control, I think, over the transport network, the roads as well. Outside of London, it's a commercial market also for public transport. So apart from the recent Bus Services Act that gives us some rights, there isn't really a right to some of that information, to using that information. You've also got a very strong position that these companies want your data, and London has got the majority of the transport trips in the UK happening in it. So I think you're actually in a very strong position to start to, ask for this information back. I think we're probably in a weaker position than yourselves, but we'll see what you do and probably pinch your good ideas.
Could I just explain the Milton Keynes system? Perhaps I ought to from the beginning. We've got 2 parallel data hubs created in Milton Keynes. One by the Open University, which is a research tool. So all the innovation, activity, testing is developed in an open form to understand the value of the data. So it brings all the data together that can be mashed up and sent out for all sorts of purposes. Parallel to that, we have a large private sector company BT, who have created a data hub exactly the same alongside it. And their interest is to commercialise that data for deployment in other areas. So they see commercial advantages in developing the systems ideas in collaboration with the research sector. And then their commercial model is to then deploy this into other cities of similar size to Milton Keynes and perhaps worldwide.
Okay, and how would somebody get, is access to that data simple? If I want to build a Milton Keynes travel app, do I have to pay BT?
You wouldn't have to pay the OU to experiment and develop your app. If you wanted then to use it commercially through the BT app system, then you would. I think that is a model, but the development, the incubation of the ideas, the thoughts in developing that can be done on a research basis through collaboration with the data hub created by the Open University. And then, as I say, then if that moves to the commercial market, that's when you can choose to go to BT and you partner with them, or you've developed the app and come and work in the city.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Copley.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, I've got some questions on demand responsive transport. So perhaps I could start with Maria. What are the potential benefits of demand responsive bus services where services can be designed in response to live passenger demand?
So with the demand response services, we can serve and we can offer to users door-to-door mobility. So as we mentioned before, one of the problems is the last mile or the access and egress mode to the main transport mode. So with on-demand services, we can solve this issue and offer a more flexible travel trip. But with on-demand services, we can also serve some areas that do not have good accessibility to public transport, or there are not a lot of other transport alternatives apart from the private car. And it can also reduce the costs of public transport system. For example, nowadays we operate some bus lines to some areas where the demand is not high. With on-demand systems, we can save this money that are for subsidize the bus route and initiate an on-demand service.
So in that last instance that you're talking about, are you saying that you'd only run these services at certain times? Is that what you're saying, to more remote parts of London?
Sorry?
Are you saying, sorry, that the last thing you said there about remote areas, are you saying that you would only run services at certain times to those areas?
They can serve these areas based on the demand. So if you know in real time the demand, you can accordingly program these services.
So, I mean, what do you think about this? So, for example, you've got the City Mapper of running a couple of bus services, one in East London on Friday and Saturday nights, where they've used their data, they've seen that there's a gap in the service, and they're running that. I mean, what do you think of the implications of that are going to be? Are we going to see more of these, do you think? Are they going to sort of replace some conventional bus routes, or are they going to supplement the existing bus routes, do you think?
I think both can happen. Some of the routes can be supplemented, but some of the routes can be replaced. Because now with the public transport system we have fixed routes, and probably the demand is not always the required one in order to match with the fixed route. Then we're going back to what we were discussing about data. So with the City Mapper bus, it is an example showing what the companies who own this data can do. So Citymapper, by having all this data about Londoners, they identified the gaps in the public transport system. So imagine if TfL had some agreements with not only Citymapper but with all the transport modes available in the city and all the transport operators. They will have amazing data about the demand for all transport modes and citizens' needs. So it is very important to have a two-way flow of data. So yes, TfL to provide the data, but also the companies to give back the data. And especially for the data from on-demand services can provide to public authorities more information about how people move around.
In terms of the bus routes, I mean, the sort of fixed bus routes, I mean, you know, quite a few of them have been around for decades, if not a century, some bus routes, and people are very attached to them. I mean, if you started to say to people, well, we're going to take out your fixed, particularly people in more remote part of London, we're going to take out your fixed bus service that you know turns up at a regular time and replace it with an on-demand service, do you think that might cause some concern about people that live there not knowing potentially when they're going to be able to, because there might be low demand at a particular time, but someone will still need to get somewhere and will be used to having a fixed bus service that arrives at a certain time. Do you think that's going to create a problem?
Of course, I think that when someone has to change his or her habit, it's difficult in the beginning and probably he is dissatisfied. But if you offer a service that it is equally convenient, he has an app and he knows when the service is coming, I think that they will get used to it pretty quickly, pretty fast, and there will not be a lot of complaints about this. And we discuss about routes that the buses run empty. So it is fixed routes that they do not have, for specific legs of the trip, they do not have passengers. So with public transport, it takes time to replace this route or to change this route. With on-demand services, it is quicker to, it is more fast to solve such issues.
Of course, we've been looking at the bus network on the Transport Committee recently, and particularly some of the issues about changing routes around Oxford Street and things like that. Do any of the other panel members want to, Brian?
Yes, I certainly recognise your later comments about removing fixed routes, because we've struggled in our city in harsh financial times that we've had to reduce bus services, especially to our rural communities, and we've had some negative feedback on that. But when you perhaps sit back and think about it, what we were doing was sending very inefficient buses at infrequent times determined by a budget into a rural community that, yes, people got used to them, but the opportunity DRT offers us is that we can send more efficient vehicles at the times when people actually want to travel. So in time, I think those communities will come to recognise, if we get it right, that we're providing a far better service, more efficient, that potentially can reduce the needs for subsidies in some of those routes. And I personally think that DRT is going to be the big thing coming around the corner because of the way we are evolving in our thinking on transport, because what we're looking to do is provide the quality of a car and the flexibility of a car in a public transport service vehicle that we can offer at the price of a bus, or very slightly above the fare, but you're getting better service. And as we move to more connected vehicles, better data, better understanding the intelligence in the vehicle, intelligence in the data, and developing a society that's more used to sharing in things they do. We don't buy videos anymore, we share them over the internet. So it's a more shared economy, it's evolving. So in the shorter term, and again with the prevalence of apps, with the information, so it's a service provision, I think there's great potential in certain circumstances that on-demand DRT could be the answer for many areas where fixed routes, mass transits just can't work.
And what do you think TfL can do to help develop these services?
I don't know.
Is it just
don't know
is it
them
just a
too.
data thing,
It's
or?
I don't know TfL too well, but I can talk about Arriva, our main bus operator in Milton Keynes, and there may be some similarities. It's shifting the thinking of a traditional bus company, bus provider, operator, away from slavishly looking to cut back routes into sort of mass transit routes and look at different models, different provisions, so they combine their services with, yes, with fixed buses on main routes, but DRT in other areas, and last mile solutions in city centres that may be connected pods or whatever. So it's about moving away from the traditional model of provision of buses for a bus operator into looking at exploring the new opportunities that are out there to provide public transport away from the big vehicle.
Just a couple of observations. The first one I'd say was you need to be careful of your mass transit network. So having lots and lots of dynamic services could start to threaten your mass transit. And as I said, you're not building new roads in London. You've got less and less road space. So the real thing, as Brian, I think others have alluded to, you need to be careful where these services are, because you don't want to slow your mass transit down and make that less attractive. So it's got to complement, I think, what's happening there. And potentially look at the gaps. As we've said, you probably have got subsidised bus services running around with a couple of people on them. There are companies that would run those services for you. We've talked about Uber, there's Get Taxi, there's others that will do ride-share type services. Citymapper are doing this bus, so there are other options that are transit. You can use these other modes potentially to do that. The other tension that we have is with these other modes is, generally for bus services, the lead time to change a bus service is very long, whereas the time to introduce one of these dynamic services is very quick. And certainly outside of London, and probably inside as well, we need to think about how we can allow the buses, the traditional core buses, to be a bit more dynamic and change as quickly as we need them to, rather than that being a very, very slow process.
Any more comments? No? Okay. Thank you.
Just a quick question from me, then I'm going to move to something. Just a quick question from me, and then I'm going to move. Okay. Okay. Just in relation to older people, and we may talk about them more in the mobility service bit, but a lot of older people don't have smartphones, or if they do, they don't know how to work them properly. Even I have to get my younger children to sort things out for me from time to time. So how do we accommodate them if they don't have a computer, or can't use a computer, don't have an app, in this new world where we have demand-led transport?
I think that is a problem, and I think that is a challenge. One of the small ways you can deal with that is you've obviously got a successful Oyster card and contactless scheme in London. You could potentially use that on these other modes of transit as well, but that doesn't help that individual call the transit in the first place. So I don't think I don't think there is an answer to this at the moment, and it's generational in a way. Is that in 10 years' time, then the generation we have now, most people do have smartphones, but we do need to look at solutions. Because again, in the world of accessibility, that smartphone solutions are not always that good. So there's still work to do, I think, on that side of things.
My question was exactly the same as yours.
Actually, I do apologise. Sorry.
You've done it.
If I'd have known you, I'd have let you ask.
The smartphone penetration in London is very high. Almost 9 out of 10 adults have a smartphone. And the population of London is the youngest in the UK. So there is a part of population that does not have smartphones, but this is only 1% of the population.
Thank you. Right, so if we can now move on to somebody member.
I know there's a $30 smartphone that's now on sale in Africa, so it's availability, I think, is getting more and more of smartphones, so it may resolve itself. Mr. Lane, could you explain to us, give us an overview of your WIN project in West Midlands, what it is and what you're trying to achieve?
So we'll start off by the principle that we're going for. First of all, we're looking at mobility as a service, which is the WIM app, effectively. We believe that mobility as a service is one of the tools that will help us solve all our problems, not all our problems, but solve some of our problems in terms of congestion, road use, public transport use. We started the project out by Atkins did a research piece of work for us to justify why we would do WIM. We took that through our political committees to get support for that. And then we decided that we'd try and do that without any money. So what we said is we'd run this commercially, which is a little bit different. I think other parts of the country have done that as a paid-for project by the public sector. But what we wanted to see is could we create a minimum viable product that would either prove or disprove mobility as a service. We think it will work, but it's not being done yet. So it's really hard to say is it or isn't it going to work. So what we used was our partnership with transport operators, with the private sector, private transport providers, with Mars Global, who are running WIM for us, and effectively we built a partnership. We are there as the facilitator, so we have spent no money on this, apart from buying a few cups of coffee and facilitating some meetings in our offices. But it's been run as a commercial solution. It's fair to say not everybody has done that. In other countries are looking at having a completely controlled solution. So where we are with the project now is we are currently doing live trials in the West Midlands. We've got people out there using the app. We've currently got bus, tram, taxi, car hire, and we're pretty close to having cycling and train built into the app within the next month or so. What we will then do is once we are confident that the app does what it says, we'll put that into real live paying customers' hands, and we'll see how that works. We will share the information, this is back to this data from Mars Global, to understand, is it having a positive impact on the West Midlands and the West Midlands transport network, or are there some unintended consequences, in which case we might need to do something. But we genuinely want to do this with them. The difference, I think, between the West Midlands and London is there would be nothing stopping Mars Global just turning up in the West Midlands and doing this now. As far as legislation is concerned, they could just come and make those partnerships and run that. We felt that we wanted to be round the table with them, understanding that and understanding whether that works. So that's where we are with the project, and we've got customers out there now using that service.
Is it fair to describe it as, and I've been trying to look and see what the app actually is it fair to say that it's like City Mapper, but that you can pay for the entire journey using that app, which you obviously can't do in City Mapper?
Yeah, that's correct. So for our pilot, for our initial implementation, we'll probably do that as a pay-as-you-go. So if you think about it more as a mobile phone tariff, we'll probably set that up as a pay-as-you-go service, so you buy a certain amount of transit, which is public and private transport. The view would be that people will move to a subscription model, just as you do with your phone. You pay a monthly fee. Mars Global's Helsinki learning was that people weren't sure to start with. It's the same with mobile phones. They'd like to try this service first. They'd like to build up a bit of confidence before they actually were prepared to put their monthly commute fee, if you like, within the app. And we'll probably take the same approach. We'll start off as pay-as-you-go, and then we'll move on to a subscription model. But that model will be Mars Global's commercial choice, and they will need to continue to attract customers through their app to do that. The app works, just to say, the app works by purely mobile ticketing, so it's all visual. So everything is done from your smartphone. You buy your travel, you book your travel, and you see what's happened. It's all done through the phone itself.
What's to prevent the app suggesting journeys that were beneficial to the provider and not necessarily the consumer?
There's nothing stopping them doing that. We view it as it's just like a normal app. If that app works for you and it's beneficial to you, you'll keep it. If it isn't, you'll probably unload it. So what we're saying is that it's a commercial market. What's stopping a phone provider selling you a service that's beneficial to them rather than to you? If you're on one of those services and you find that out, you'll probably change provider. And what we're saying within the West Midlands, whilst Mars Global are the first provider, we don't see them as the only provider. We would be happy to talk to other mobility as service providers.
That's reassuring. So you're not setting, and the one thing that came from me looking at this was I'm a bit concerned if effectively a public authority is getting in with a monopoly provider, but you
Absolutely.
are going to welcome competitors to
Yes,
this.
and actually around the table we have a competitor from the car sector who might run a mobility as a service but quite different to the Mars Global one, but at the moment they don't want to be mentioned in terms of named.
So you're going to be doing the monitoring, which is one of the other questions that I wanted to ask you, how do you think you will judge it if it's at 6?
Well, it's great that we've got Maria here, because we've been talking to Maria and UCL and Transport Systems Catapult. One about the research UCL have already done on mobility as a service, which is excellent. So it's good work in London. But we've also talked about how we might understand the impact of mobility as a service in the West Midlands. And again, we're working with the Catapult to seek some funding and some resources to do quite a sophisticated piece of research on not just the West Midlands, but further afield on on how it would work elsewhere.
So can anybody sign up to it at the moment? I know online there is a...
There's a lot of interest online, but nobody signed up to use the service commercially yet. That's our October launch effectively. So what we'll be doing is attracting customers in October to pay for the service.
Well, we'll certainly keep an eye on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we're talking well with the guys at TfL anyway on progress and where we're getting with that.
Just, obviously, you're associating yourself with this app quite rightly, but you're public sector. If this app was doing the things that Assemblymember Boff's talking about in terms of encouraging you perhaps to use a taxi or a private hire for a bit of a journey because that's in the some sort of commercial interest rather than actually it's a 5-minute walk.
Yeah. It's like City Mapper, encourages you to use Uber.
I don't look at it, to be honest.
Never encouraged me.
No, nobody's ever encouraged me to use Uber.
But
just you're as it kind of associated with this, almost endorsing it. Is there potentially a conflict then? How are you protecting that? Because actually, a lot of people put trust in a public authority linked.
I think that's why that's why we wanted to sit round the table with them and why they've agreed to share the data with us. So we will understand what they're doing and what they're saying. And as we've gotten so far, all the discussions are they are supportive of sustainable travel. So they support our core objectives. Their business model also supports that because the more times you can get somebody on a bus rather than in a taxi or a hire car, the better it is for them as well. So at the moment that supports us. If we find that there are unintended consequences, then we might need to take action to mitigate against those. But at the moment we're trying to do that in partnership, trying to do that in as open a way as we possibly can.
Okay, thank you.
Right, so finally, Member Sahota.
Thank you. I just want to talk about the mobility as a service in London. What do you think are the barriers of bringing this sort of service to London?
So I think London's in an excellent and also the most difficult position. In a way, from a public transport point of view, you've got strong control of that. But the challenge then is what do you do about these other modes? What do you do about taxis? What do you do about this? And I think it is a real challenge for you to decide, do you try and regulate in some way to have those as part of the app? Or do you let the market take its own decision? I suspect with London you can't really let the market take its own decision because you've got such a sensitive network that if unintended things happen, it's going to cause you congestion. That will just cause problems. So it's really deciding, I think, London needs to decide how you want to enter this particular market and whether you control that through the TfL sort of payments infrastructure, the work that you've done with Oyster and now with Contactless, and whether you use that as almost a clearinghouse for any mobility service provider that wants to come in. But go back to the original point that Maria sort of backed up, is the data is really important. What these companies are doing and how they're impacting the London transport network is really, really critical for you to do that. I can safely say these companies want to come and work in London. So we spoke to Mars Global, they would dearly love to have a WIM app running today in London. So the interest is there, and they definitely would like to work in London. But they might need to work a little bit differently with yourselves than they would with us.
Okay. And how difficult is it to bring together journey planning, booking, payments into one app?
So they've done that. That's live now.
Yes.
They built that in Helsinki. They basically adopted the Helsinki work to the West Midlands. So I've got an app today that you can see that will plan your journey. It'll give you a choice whether you want to use public transport. If you're in a hurry, it'll put you on a taxi. Trains in there as well, or you can walk. All of that's paid for within the app. Or if you know you want to do a specific thing, if you actually know you want a taxi, or you know you want a particular type of ticket, you can go straight to that and buy that. So they've done that work already. But they are using this data that we talked about right at the start So it's this data that comes from the public sector in the first place, this quality data. So without those types of services, they wouldn't have an app, they wouldn't have anything to run.
And do you think this would increase the demand on the increase or decrease demand on public transport use?
So I think the initial, I mean, Maria might be better to explain this to me, but our initial discussions with Mars Global is that through the app they've seen increased active travel and increased use in Helsinki in Finland. We're expecting to see more use of public transport. Our private transport operators believe these are new customers, which is why they're participating. So they believe that this isn't just shuffling people around what we've already got, but they genuinely believe they're new customers. Mars Global want to get people out of their cars. They want you not to buy a new car. They want you to spend that money on the app and not to have a car. So that's their ethos, if you like. And if they can achieve that, even in a small fraction of people, then they've actually done a pretty good job.
Maria, did you want to say something on this?
So yes, we recently published a survey about the impact of mobility as a service for London and also Londoners' attitudes and perceptions towards car ownership and mobility as a service. So the results indicate that when you have access to all the transport modes, there are higher possibilities to use public transport modes, and then also some modes that you have not thought before to use, like bike sharing. So this mobility as a service app or system could be used as a demand management tool. So you can give access to users to all the transport modes available in the city, and they can access these transport modes without the need to have a different account for this transport mode or to have a different payment method for this transport mode. So I can share with you this report later. So we have identified that there is a shift from private cars to public transport. There is also a shift from private cars to taxi and all these ride-hailing services. There is also a small shift from public transport users to ride-hailing services, but on average, when you put everything together, there is an increase in public transport demand.
Thank you. I mean, if that report is available, if you send it to the chair, it will be very helpful.
Yes, I will send you this report.
And
one more thing.
Yes.
So in 2015, we have also done the feasibility study for mobility as a service for London. And we investigated both the supply side and the demand side, because if the infrastructure is not there or the data is not available, this concept will not work. In London, and especially in zones 1, 2, and 3, we have several transport modes, the one next to other. So someone can have easily access to more than one transport modes. And since we have the infrastructure there, it is very easy to initiate such a system for London.
Okay. Thank you for that. And what do you think will be the impact on the London transport fares of this system, if this application was available? What do you think will be the impact on the transport fares, rather?
So these are now marketing techniques. When you bundle different services together, you can have discounts, so the users can save money. On the other hand, because I assume that you care more about the income of public transport users and the public transport system, when you bundle the services and you offer a monthly mobility package, the mass operator sells to the user a monthly pass for public transport modes. So either the user will not use the public transport or use the public transport, the public transport authority is going to get, they are going to be paid for this monthly pass. So nothing changes with the fares. And in case the demand for some transport modes increase, then you can have agreements on getting better prices based on the demand or capacity you sell.
Great. Thank you for that. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed. That's been... sorry, John, did you want to add anything before we finish?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. So thank you very much indeed for your time. Very grateful to you. We've made some notes and if we can pass that information forward, that'd be useful
And
as well.
this report, sorry for interrupting, has also some insights about how to integrate the automated vehicles, so mobility as a service can pave the way to automated vehicles and shared automated vehicles.
Okay, thank you. Right, so once again, thank you very much for your time. We just need 2 seconds of your time while we finish business and then we'll wrap it up. So if I can just, first of all, the committee has recommended to note the scope and terms of reference for the investigation into future transport as agreed under delegated authority by the Chairman in consultation with the Deputy Chairman and Party Group Leads. Thank you. Note the report and discussion.
Noted.
And agreed to delegate authority to the Chairman in consultation with the Deputy Chairman and Party Group Leads to agree any related site visits. Finally, or penultimately actually, number 11, date of the next meeting is Tuesday the 10th of October, and that's in the Chamber, and I don't believe there's any other business. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Very much.
Good too.
Yes. Will we?
Yeah.
That's right.